So this is what we would call a standard demographic profile. This is Mexico. Lots of children, fewer young adults, fewer mature adults, retirees at the top, and mortality builds it into a pyramid. And when you look at something like this, you're going to have a very different economic structure than what you might have for a country as opposed to Germany. So here's Germany, very heavy in the middle age, moving towards retiree. And the difference between the two here is that in Mexico, you're going to have a consumption-led system because young people do most of the spending. And in Germany, you're going to have an investment-led system because when you're in your 40s and your 50s, you're saving for retirement. That simple dichotomy is kind of what drives most of what's going on in the global economy and has been driving the global economy for the last 30 years. What that means is we've been in this world where most of the developing world has been the consumption base, and most of the developed world has been the investment base. And that means the propensity for trade between the two is extreme because the poorer countries need the cash, the more advanced countries need the consumption. And so you can have things going back and forth. The Germans are good at high-end stuff, the Mexicans tend to be good at low-end stuff, and some version of this is replicated around the world. So in an environment since the end of the Cold War, when you've got global security provided by the Americans, but no real global security challenges, everybody pours money into economic development. And so from 1990 until roughly 2017, we had the greatest economic boom in human history. And I dare say for most people in the investment world, this is the world that they think is normal. It's not normal. It's the most historically atypical period we have ever known as a species. And it was always going to end, because the developing world is aging rapidly, far more rapidly than the rich world ever did. And so they're becoming Germany, but without the infrastructure, without the institutions, without the respect for democracy, without the capital structure, without the industrial base. As well, the Germans and other countries like them are aging into mass retirement. So instead of a world where we've got propensity for growth and cooperation and trade, we're moving into a world where the rich world is all retired. They're neither producing nor consuming. And the developing world is becoming aged and losing that consumption edge, but without building the capacity to move up the value-added chain. You would call this an economic dislocation, which is a very nice way to say global collapse and depression. There are a few countries that stand out as exceptions to that. The United States is at the top of the list. We have the youngest demography in the rich world. And we already have a demography that is younger than China's and will be younger than Brazil's within 20 years. So the United States is slipping into kind of this pocket reality where it builds its own stuff, trades with itself, and maybe a select group of other countries. And say what you will about the Trump administration, and there are so many things that we can say about the Trump administration. One of the things they got right is picking out specific countries that they wanted to have relationships with after this transition. So we've had 4 big successes in trade negotiations: Japan, Korea, Mexico, Canada, and we're probably going to have a 5th one with the United Kingdom this year. That's the majority of the American trade relationship. So the United States, under normal circumstances, given 3, 4, 5 years, could have transitioned from where we are right now to that sort of friends and family trading plan without suffering a recession. What the Saudis are doing is any place they see a competitor, first and foremost the Russians, where they've got a pipeline that empties out into a populated area or a pipeline that hits a port, they are sending super tankers of crude to super saturate demand in those locations, specifically going after things like Rotterdam or Suez or Korea that are popular transshipment points for Russian crude, making sure that the tanks are completely full so the Russian crude has nowhere to go. They're doing this to a slightly less intense degree wherever all their other competitors are. So, for example, slightly less intense, there's 50 million barrels of crude from Saudi Arabia coming to the American Gulf Coast to try to knock shale out. That's nothing compared to what they're doing to Europe and Asia. And the goal is just to fill up all the tanks so that the producers have nowhere to sell their crude whatsoever. So they have to shut down their pipelines and they have to shut down their wells. Now, in a place like the United States, if you do this and the wells get shut in, they can be turned back on later. And from the point that you start drilling a shale well to the day you get first crude is only about 6 weeks. So U.S. shale is going to take a hell of a hit. There's probably about 1 million barrels per day of production already offline. Probably another 2 million are going to happen before the end of the year. That's probably going to be front loaded. That's a 25% reduction in shale output. That's a big deal. But it'll be back in a couple of years. But if you shut in wells in Nigeria and Siberia, they're gone. It's going to be years, if not a decade, before you see those producing again. So the Saudis are taking a long haul here, taking a big economic hit on the front side. They can afford it. Across the Gulf, Iran, say what you will about the Trump administration, he won. Iran is no longer a net oil exporter. They're going to actually be importing over the summer, which is something they have not had to do in over a century. I don't think that this is going to cause regime change. Anytime you've got 100,000 people in your elite, it takes a really big stick to move that. But this is the end of Iran having cash, which means Iran in Lebanon and in Gaza and Iraq and Syria and all the other places that the Iranians have had their fingers, all of a sudden they don't have any money to back it up. They're massively overextended, which raises the opportunity for countries like Turkey or Saudi Arabia to turn the tide in their favor. So expect a lot more nutsoid violence in this region because the Iranians, everyone forgets, the Iranians are not the violent actors here. That's the Saudis. ISIS came from Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda came from Saudi Arabia. And we should expect to see a lot more groups like that boiling up throughout this entire region, just burning down everything that the Iranians think that they have achieved in the last 10 years. It's going to be wretchedly awful. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, UAE, those countries, the very rich countries of the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, they're involved in a global price war, primarily with the Russians, but not exclusively anymore. They are deliberately trying to drive oil prices as low as possible, negative if they can, and I think they can. And if they pull this off, I'd say even odds at present, it's going to take about 20 million barrels of crude production globally offline for years, and they will finally have what they wanted, which is a crude market where they can set the price and set the volume over the midterm. Looks broadly like they're going to be able to pull that off. The Saudis have tried something like this 3 or 4 times in the last 15 years, but the market has never been right. Now, the market's right. The emotion and the leadership are also kind of lined up. The Saudis originally went to the Russians with a deal for a preemptive cut to manage the oil market back in January and February, and the Russians said no. So the Saudis got pissed off. This wouldn't have worked without global oil demand being down by 20, 30 million barrels a day. Second, leadership. We got a new guy in charge, Mohammed bin Salman. If you've seen my readings or writings, you know that he's not my favorite person. He kind of makes Putin look like a kinder, gentler kind of gentleman, but he's young. And he's taken the institutions of Saudi Arabia by storm. He's consolidating power. And honestly, this is what a king does. And if this works for him, he will have consolidated his person as the most powerful person in the region for at least the next couple of decades. I think he's aware of that. This is his proving ground. And so far, in my opinion, it's going really well for him.